So first, let me introduce our speaker, Ben Holtzman. So Professor Ben Holtzman is a friend of our lab. So he is a visiting professor at Yale in 2011. And he is currently a research professor in seismology division at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and adjunct professor at the music department at Columbia. So that's why he's talking about music today. Ben did his undergraduate in geology at Brown and a PhD at David Costet's lab at the University of Minnesota in geophysics. And Ben has mostly worked on high temperature rock deformation and the interaction of rheology and melt migration during his PhD. But now he's a seismologist. So today let's welcome Ben to talk about his music heard from the geothermal field.
All right. Thank you, so you didn't actually tell us what you were for Thanksgiving, for Halloween. Okay, so I want to talk about this work that we've been doing for the last year and a half or so. I wanted to work on geothermal for a long time. During Obama's presidency, I kept getting funded to do the high temperature stuff. And so I couldn't actually get to work on this, and now it's a great time to work in geothermal. So it's kind of an act of resistance. So what we're doing, I'm gonna first describe this group because it does kind of set up the range of topics that are getting mixed here. So I don't know, some form of geophysicist. John is the machine learning wizard, so I'm really, I don't have much background in machine learning or statistics and stuff, but so I'm trying to, learn as fast as I can from him. Arthur was a postdoc with me and with Lapo, but he came from psychoacoustics. So psychoacoustics is a funny little field. It's a mixture of cognitive science, psychology and acoustics, and it's about how we understand sound and perceive sound. Mostly it's not, sounds that we don't, that are not speech or music or things like that. Really about perception. Felix is a real seismologist. Douglas is a sound artist, and he and I have worked on the sonification methods that you'll hear. And Lapo's also a real seismologist. And then there are pieces that I have lots of discussions with the LBL geothermal group, the Los Alamos group, and GFZ. So this is related to what Georg Drazen spoke about 2 weeks ago, I think. And so there's some work from these guys who are in Georg's group at GFZ. Okay, so I'm going to introduce this stuff by talking about human perception, because this is a very different kind of machine learning than what most people are doing in seismology. And then talk about what the relationship between the machine listening, as it's sometimes called, and unsupervised methods as analogs to the kind of human perception studies. Applications to the Geysers seismicity problem, and so I'll mostly talk about the machine learning stuff before talking about the geothermal application, and then how we understand what these clusters mean, what the results are telling us. Okay, so I would say most of what's happening in seismology now, in machine learning, as we start to figure out how to use these tools, is focused on using supervised learning for detection. And they're fingerprint-based methods or matched filter kinds of methods. and then neural network kind of methods. And you know, there's so much exciting sort of discovery that's coming out of these tools, but really because they're enhancing our ability to perceive patterns. So supervised versus unsupervised is a difference I guess a lot of people know, but in a supervised family of methods, you're going to train the algorithms on something, an output that's known, and discriminate or predict that output from an input, and then try to predict output that you haven't trained the data on. Okay, train the algorithm on. In an unsupervised approach, there's no training step. So you're looking for patterns, but you don't know what the output is going to be, and therefore you don't know necessarily how to interpret those. So in detection, you can think of Google's PageRank. These guys have used it just as an enhancing detection algorithm. But what we're doing is characterization, I would call it. It's feature extraction that allows us to identify features that are much more subtle than what we can do just by looking at waveforms or picking phases and things like that, or looking at spectra, moment tensors. So, in a sense, these two things they're opposite and complementary. So, in detection, you have to seek similarity. You have to say, I want to find smaller and smaller events in the noise, and so I'm going to teach my algorithm what to look for by using larger events. Right? Once they're identified, then you can ask, how are they different? So this is where listening is a good analog, right? So I think of this as more of a like getting a new microscope than artificial intelligence. And like, it's just enhancing our ability to perceive patterns more than any kind of decision making or learning. So what do we mean by perception? And human perception is a pretty clear demonstration of a kind of decomposition of sound. So here's a waveform, right? A seismic waveform that looks a lot like a sound wave. So if you take one channel of a seismometer, speed it up into the audible range, you can then play it through a speaker, and the motion of the cone is analogous to the motion of the ground, producing pressure waves. They go into your ear, right? There's a great movie, I can send you a link, of how the whole auditory system works in a biophysical sense. But what we need here is just this idea of tonotopic organization, and that's that the cochlea separates frequency in time. Okay, so there are different parts of the cochlea that are going to vibrate at different, when they're excited by different frequencies in the information that's coming in. Okay. So essentially that's producing a spectrogram, and this is a frequency time. This is produced by short time Fourier transforms, which are essentially what the cochlea is doing. And this is a better representation of how we perceive sound than a spectrum, than a waveform is. Okay. So the auditory nerves are all along here, inside this little space right there.
Do they perceive the sign or just an amplitude or an intensity?
You perceive the sign of
SIGN. In other words, is it like the eye is just seeing intensity?
Yeah.
Like the phase information is
So
far away.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, the phase is all in there. I don't think we when you look at it this way, you throw away the phase information. But it is related to our tone memory, right? So a kind of nice piece of information is that we can tell the difference between a voice and an instrument in 10 microseconds. Right? That's how fast the feedback between the neural cortex and the cochlea is. So you can figure out sort of what frequency band you need to get enough information to separate out from the overtones the difference between a voice and an instrument. So we're set up to analyze harmonic sounds all the time, but also non-harmonic sounds. So the question, like bangs and pops and earthquakes. So the question is, what can we identify in earthquake physics using sound? And the human auditory system is very adept at interpreting physics through sound, right? You can tell that I'm hitting different things. You can tell a lot about the acoustic space in the room but you don't know what you're picking up, right? It's not the click. It's the stuff after the click. So we did these experiments with about 30 people, 15 seismologists and 15 acousticians, listening to 17 different transportable array stations in Oklahoma. So this was a big 5.4, I think. And this is, we don't have the state. This is basically Oklahoma, not the whole thing, but okay. So here's an example waveform. We sped it up by a factor of 150, and I'll play some of these in a minute. So these were recorded at 40 hertz, and that becomes 6,000 hertz when we play it back. And here's how this experiment works. So you sit at a computer, and you have this screen where you have all these icons, and you click on those icons, and it plays the sound. And we just ask people to cluster them by similarity. That's the only directive, all right? And people make these clusters, and then they can color them, and then we ask them to describe in words how they describe the differences among these clusters. Okay, and then we look at the statistics of consistency in people's categorization. So a free categorization experiment is a really good analogy to unsupervised learning. Right? We're just asking people to cluster things. We're not telling them what the output should be at all. Right? And we expected people to separate basically by distance. And what happened was to first order that happened. So the colors are clusters that had a strong correlation among the listeners. Right? So here are the nearest ones, and then there are clusters that are farther. But the second order difference was a difference between the north and the south. So you can see these are kind of still distance, but this cluster in black symbols was a total surprise to us. And here's the Rayleigh wave phase velocity map of the area of study. So you can see that there are lower phase velocities in the area where these black things are. Okay. So here I'm going to play, here are the near sounds. Right, so that's the separation of the PNS wave. Right, so that's the difference between north and south. Is all in your perceived pitch, right? It's attenuation, scattering, killing off the higher frequencies. So it's the difference between this room being empty and having no carpets and being carpeted and full of people. Okay.
Do you have a recording of dispersed surface waves?
I have lots of those.
Let's put it together an album.
Yeah, so they always have a chirp, right? And how much of that chirp you focus on depends on how much you've shifted it in frequency. Yeah. Okay, so how much can we learn about the physics of the earthquake through the sound? And as seismologists, we're always asking to separate out the differences between the source and the path and the station effects, right? And lots of clever ways of doing that. And so that experiment was one earthquake, so we're not going to learn anything about the source. We've done other studies where we keep the path the same and change the source. But and we're not also, but what we're learning about in that study was really some combination of the path and the station effects, the acoustic space around the station, which is kind of like the acoustic space around your head. Okay, so when we started to work with John Paisley, so Dan Ellis was a professor at Columbia. He moved to Google, but he worked in the Echo Nest, which started at the Media Lab, which is the methods underlying Spotify's classification, music information retrieval stuff. So Dan connected us to John, who had not worked in audio so much, but had worked on these non-negative matrix factorization methods. And we'll talk about those in a second. And the idea was to set up machine listening experiments that were analogous to our human listening experiments. So here's the process in a quick nutshell. We convert the seismic signals to spectrograms, which are just images, so they're all positive values. And then we decompose those using non-negative matrix factorization, which focuses on the feature extraction for frequencies. And then this hidden Markov model focuses on feature extraction for the temporal aspects. And then we produce these fingerprints. So these fingerprints represent differences between signals, much more than similarities. And I'll show you that in a second. So we're doing unsupervised learning now. We cluster based on similarities of differences. So we calculate the differences and then find the ones that are different in similar ways. Okay, and then we search for empirically for physical correlation. All right, and eventually we want to get to supervised learning, where we can do labeling, where we can say this kind of fingerprint is associated with a certain process. Right? And that's way off, not way off, but that's the goal. So going from unsupervised to supervised that's where the engineering applications for geothermal or for identifying precursors to earthquakes will come. So the main goal is feature extraction and also dimensionality reduction, so that we can analyze very large data sets. So this was the initial paper on non-negative matrix factorization as it was applied to faces. So millions of pictures of like little passport photos of faces, where you can reconstruct any face by learning a dictionary of face parts and an activation matrix of which of these features you need to activate to produce that face. So this is general to all faces, and this is unique to each face. Okay, This is also used for text, for topic modeling in text. And essentially the idea is you can approximate any data set by factorizing it into a dictionary and a matrix of activation coefficients. Okay, so for example, this column, you're activating this feature and this feature. Right? Okay, so when we do this on a spectrogram, we get a dictionary that looks like this, where this axis is frequency, and this is the new axis, the new dimension that is representing K is the number of features we need to describe, to reconstruct this guy. And then this is K, and this is the activation of those features. So the first thing I want to point out is really the most important. When you look at this spectrogram, you see an impulsive event, right? All the earthquakes that we're analyzing, they're not tremor, they're not like building up slowly. They're all impulsive small events. So all that information gets encoded in the dictionary. Right? It's the amplitudes of the features that are needed to reproduce the impulsive events are encoded right here. That's not what jumps out at you visually. Right? What's interesting in this matrix is all this stuff in the coda, how the energy decays. Right? And that's much closer to what we perceive as the differences among sounds. Right? It's perceived pitch. In the coda is how we tell a carpeted room from a concrete room. Right? And
the X is literally a matrix multiplying as we
yep.
know.
Yeah. But the key is that this is common to all. This is unique to each. And in the next step, we just keep the activation matrix. We don't care about what is common to everything anymore. Right? And I think this is very close to how we discriminate among sounds. So if we're comparing bangs, we don't focus on the fact that they're all bangs. We listen to the differences among those bangs. So the next step is to take that activation matrix and model it with a hidden Markov model. And that's going to go find, so this is the K dimension, these are the features in that dictionary. And it's going to search for associations among those features. So it's going to ask, where are there features that co-occur? And it's going to call that set of co-occurring features a hidden state. So it's going to reduce that dimension down to a number of states, and this is still a temporal information. Right? So this set is probably the impulsive stuff, and you can see it. It's activated here, and then it goes back to the noise. So there's noise before. So now you can see the impulse again, but it's encoded in a much more subtle or embedded way. And then a lot of the information that is then going to be clustered upon is in here. And then to make the fingerprint, you're just doing counting statistics, sliding along here and saying, when do I jump from state 1 to state 3, from state 3 to 4, back to 3, back to 1. So the fingerprint is a matrix of the next state and the past state. And you're just putting beans in each box as you go through. So there's temporal information embedded in here, but you can't go backwards and reconstruct the signal from the fingerprint. Okay. And then we do standard k-means clustering on those. So each of these steps is unsupervised. There's no training But the really heavy machine learning steps are the NMF and the HMM. And they're large feature extractions. Each one takes, for 46,000 events, it took about a day on a laptop for each of those. So when we start doing larger data sets, we'll need clusters and things. But okay, so the only thing that you specify in this is a maximum number of allowable features, and it searches for the minimum that it needs, and then a number of clusters. Okay, so how well do these methods work on earthquakes? In geothermal, the problem is we're inducing seismicity. In the geysers case, water is just being poured down into a hot rock that's already fractured, a fractured network that is full of fluid and steam, right? So it's different from the enhanced geothermal problem where you need to create a fracture network. But it also has the highest seismicity rate of any geothermal reservoir, as far as I know. So in a mechanical framework, what's happening is there are going to be hydraulic stresses from either fluid pressure that's applied or fluid transforming to steam and the volume increase. And then there are going to be thermal stresses that can either activate shear fractures or create new existing fractures or create new thermal cracks. So you can kind of, the system can be moving around locally and temporally anywhere in this regime. So there's a background tectonic stress, there are pre-existing faults, and then there are these new sources of stress that can either create their own fractures or activate existing fractures. Right, right now we're just listening to one station, one component, the vertical component. So let's see, the black dots here are the injection wells. This is the geysers. It's on the border between Lake and Sonoma counties in Northern California. There were big fires right around here this summer. And these are the seismic stations. And there's one well where they're doing enhanced geothermal that the Berkeley group has been studying. We're just looking at places where they're just pouring water down these holes, all right? They're not pumping it. Okay. Here's the earthquake catalog that we analyzed in our first study. And here are the clustering results. So the first thing we looked for was any spatial patterns. We thought maybe there would be certain faults that would give us one kind of earthquake, and other faults give us another kind of earthquake, or different parts of the reservoir that would have different kinds of earthquakes. And we didn't see any reservoir-scale patterns. Okay? And in depth, same thing. You see clumps, but you don't see any kind of stratification. The color represents the cluster number. Right? Yeah. And then magnitude, there was one cluster that got all the bigger earthquakes. So everything that was about 1.5 or higher was put into one cluster, and the rest had about the same mean magnitude. So magnitude is not the discriminating the cause of the clustering. This is just a Gutenberg-Richter plot showing that the b-values for the different clusters are the same, essentially.
Cluster number is from your analysis or
Yep.
third-party clustering?
No, this is our method.
And it doesn't distinguish deep from shallow?
No.
So the delay is not something that's,
No.
PS delay is not?
No.
Okay.
No, yeah. That kind of information is going to be a very small contributor to the fingerprint. Yeah, and here's the depth statistics. Don't look at that. That's the answer. So, yeah, there's a horizon that has most of the earthquakes, and then there's a funny subtle change here that I can talk about at the end if you want. But when we plotted them, yeah.
So on your fingerprints for the waveforms, are you starting at the origin time or the p-arrival time?
The p-arrival time. It shouldn't matter in theory, but we thought we would eliminate that complexity. So we then plotted the clusters temporally. So these are histograms for each cluster. So the color is the number of events in each time window. And the black curve here is the average injection rate of fluid over the whole Geysers reservoir. And this is the number of earthquakes through time. So in cluster 1, these are winter earthquakes, and then the next winter they occur again, and then you can see them kind of coming back in 2014, which was which really got its own cluster. Right? So here's the 3 years, and then cluster 4 got these sort of late summer earthquakes, which is the minimum in the injection rate. The injection rate is controlled by taking runoff water from the streets in nearby cities, and they're pumping it up into the reservoir and pouring it down those injection wells. So in the winter, when there's, it's really just reflecting the rain. It's not reflecting groundwater, like rain from the surface. That's a very small volume compared to what's collected over these cities and pumped in. And so really there are just minima in injection rate earthquakes and maxima injection rate earthquakes. And there's probably a lag, a kind of a delay after those peaks. And if we use 20 clusters, we get the same thing. We just see a little more detail in the separation. So I've been showing the smallest number of clusters that picks up this pattern. Okay. All right, here's just another representation showing there are these earthquakes that occur relative to the peaks in injection and then in the minima in injection rate. And 2014 was a drought year, so there was an extended time of low injection rate. Right? There was a smaller peak and then a longer time of low injection rate, and that got a significantly different acoustic pattern. Okay, so now we can listen to these. So here are the 3 most typical earthquakes of the cluster 1, the high injection time, and the 3 most typical earthquakes of cluster 4, the low injection time. Right? So those were 2 events from cluster 1. And 2 events from cluster 4. Anybody hear differences? What do you hear?
Resonance in the second.
What?
Resonance?
Yeah,
In the second.
there's a longer ringing in the second ones, right? What else? What?
So each on the second one.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so slightly higher pitch and longer resonance.
Is the background the sound of pumps or the sound of something else that's atmospheric?
I don't know. Yeah, we have to do comparative station listening to figure that out.
But you haven't identified whether this is ground noise or atmospheric noise.
No, and there are a lot of turbines. There's 25 turbines, power stations over the reservoir, so it could be those.
It does sound like
Yeah, I agree.
that. These are real time, not altered time.
These are slowed down a little bit, I think. These are 500 hertz stations. They're either real time or slowed down slightly.
Playback at 500 hertz, not at speed up compressed.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So if you did speed it up, would
Yeah.
the human ear perceive different differences?
I think the higher we sped it up, the easier it would be to hear that
Same
difference in
waveform,
perceived
you're
pitch.
just
Yeah,
compressing it in time,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then you hear
yeah,
more differences.
yeah. Oh yeah, they're definitely sped up because they're 20-second signals and they're playing back in about 4 seconds, 3 or 4 seconds. So it's a factor of 10 faster. Yeah. Okay, so here's a kind of synthesis movie. We're making synthetics. We're using synthetic sounds for each earthquake. So these are actually sped up seismograms, but we make a library and pluck out each sound to build a soundtrack using the Catalogue. So as a function of depth and magnitude. And you can hear, listen to when we get to 2014, you'll hear a difference. So you can hear a difference in the earthquake rate. Now, so this is now representing each cluster with a different tone. So these are major thirds apart, and then that's the fluid injection volume. Right?
I'm sorry. What was
Oops. The tones represent the clusters.
But those are pure tones, so
Yeah.
what are they? They're synthetic something?
They're purely synthetic. They're just, and then the clicks are the fluid injection rate. Okay, so it's a sonic representation of the patterns. Just to bring home that correlation between the injection rate and the clusters themselves. Okay. Oops. Okay, so now this is the work in progress with the GFZ group, here's the whole geysers area, and now we're just listening to this one little corner in the upper northwest. Right? So it's kind of somehow quite isolated from the rest of the reservoir. So there are 2 injection wells. So here's the northwest tip of the whole reservoir. And it's this little pocket that we're listening to. So there are 2 injection wells and 1 production well. And I think we're listening to this station, actually. So if we zoom in there, you can see they've done very detailed analyses of the moment tensors for earthquakes above 1 or so. And so they see subtle temporal patterns in normal and strike slip. So they get, I haven't shown those plots, but there are small changes in the ratios of normal and strike slip faults. So here are the injection wells, the production well, and this is a cross section showing the depth. So they're again in the sort of 2 to 2.5 kilometer depth range. So we sent them our clustering information, and they sent back the clustering, for the events that they have moment tensors. They've sent back those moment tensor properties for us to look at the clustering. Well, they yeah, back and forth. So again, there's no real spatial pattern in the clustering that we can pick out. There are just more earthquakes down here, which is near the more active injection well. And here's the same representation of the clustering results. So here's the total number of events is closely tracking the water injection. This is 2010 to 2015. So again, there's a cluster that is associated with the peak injection rates. And then it kind of shifts into a different set of clusters that also pick up the injection rate peaks and minima.
So right here, you're clustering the moment tensor?
Nope. This is the exact same analysis just by the spectral properties. And I'll show you. So we thought, again, wrong again. We thought that there would be associations with the moment tensors. I'll show you that in a sec. This green curve is the injection in the second well that turned on in mid 2010 and turned off in mid 2013. So again, magnitude and time. So here's a histogram of magnitude. They're showing magnitude time, and their cluster numbers are colored this way. So there's one cluster that is getting, again, all of the earthquakes that are bigger than 1.5, and then everything else has these kind of temporal patterns below 1.5. I think that's just a signal to noise thing. But interestingly, this point here, where that clustering by magnitude breaks down, is where that second injection well turned on. So there was suddenly this boost in potential from the fluid pressure or the thermal cracking or whatever is causing this change. Okay. Now here was the surprise. So this is the isotropic component of the moment tensor. And there's really no cluster, there's no pattern by isotropic component. Okay. And here's the double couple percent going from 0 to 100. So there's a lot of variability in the double couple component, but that's also not what's determining the clustering. And there's also no relationship, clear relationship to the orientation of the moment tensor. Okay, so how do we understand this stuff? Okay, so there are three really. What happens in the reservoir when fluid injection rate changes? You can change attenuation, you can change the moment tensors, and I just showed you a very tentative note, and changes in the frictional properties. So attenuation, this is the distance from the station to the events, or vice versa, events to station, over the half length of the geysers, the whole reservoir. So this is how much amplitude energy you could lose by attenuation or scattering for quality factors from 20 to 200. Right, so high quality factors, less attenuation. This is the log of the amplitude. So if it was very strong, we would expect spatial clustering, because you'd lose a lot of the high frequency information, and that should lead to a clustering by distance from the station that you're listening to. And that's not at all what we see. And then in the more local study, there's a very small potential for attenuation, because these distances are so short, and a lot of that path is also through a part of the reservoir that's not going to be changing its water fraction very much, because the injection is happening in these parts here. So I don't think that scattering or attenuation is the dominant cause of the temporal clustering. It's possible, but it's also you would have to change the properties over a large volume of rock to get there. Okay, I'll wrap this up in 1 second. Now, changes in frictional properties are to me seem to be the most likely cause. So these are experiments by Greg McClaskey, where he's just looking at the spectra of acoustic emissions or stick slip events that where they're varying the hold time between each event. So they're letting the interface heal and the contact points increasing in their area more and more, or actually less and less. And then looking, so when your hold time is very long, you get a lot more high frequency energy than when your hold time is very short. And that, you could interpret that as producing more and more small disparities as that surface heals. Okay. And I think this is the kind of thing that we're picking up. So when you pour water down into that reservoir, these new sources of stress can change the asperity distribution. And you can think of it, I did this morning. Cool water's coming in, right? You're kind of introducing new damage to that fault surface, producing small scale thermal cracking, right? Because you're contracting just those near inner surface parts of the interface. And that should produce more high frequency sounds, probably. More, you have more small asperities. And then as the fluid heats up and can push apart that interface, and also you're getting water deeper in to some rock volume, causing a deeper thermal contraction. So you may have fewer small asperities, so we should expect lower frequency in the kind of cumulate waveform, and that's when you get your steam hot water out. So for geothermal, I think we want to optimize this. We want to be able to engineer and know when we're in this kind of state, if this is what's happening, and be able to label that cluster, those waveforms by thermo-mechanical state, and identify transitions from this kind of state to this kind of state, and use that information to stay here. So that's just the kind of the goal. Yeah, so I can, yeah, just quickly, unsupervised machine listening methods are allowing us to pick up these very subtle differences in source spectra. And we can do that in much smaller earthquakes than we can do with standard analysis methods. And I think another underlying point is that when we just look at earthquake spectra, like just the Fourier transform of an event, we're throwing away a lot of information that may be important for understanding the source mechanics. And so we need to understand what the spectral differences are. And that's what kind of going back and listening is helpful for, and what causes them. So we need experiments. We're going to develop 3-component and network analyses, and also analyzing the noise. And then we'd like to get to a classification capability. All right, thanks.
Ben, thank you for your very informative talk, and we enjoyed the music show very much. So we have time for 2 quick questions. So anyone have more questions? Hi, Dale.
Excellent talk.
Thank you.
But at the end,
Mm-hmm.
do you think your machine can listen better than the people in the seismic, stations that actually do this by listening?
Yeah.
What's your feeling at the end?
I think the iteration between pulling out this kind of clustering, this kind of information, and then us going to listen is gonna improve our understanding.
Of course.
So, it's like the microscope doesn't understand anything. It just helps us get deeper.
Hi, Greg.
Similar to Dale's question, there's a lot of psychoacoustic work that tries to simulate downstream from the cochlea.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about using that as sort of inputs into your produced feature space?
Yeah.
That might help you discriminate and
Yeah.
do things a bit cheaper.
Interesting. Yeah. So by downstream from the cochlea, what's the?
I can't remember the name of, but there's software like EarLab that tries to simulate neuron firing later. And does a lot of sort of some of this encoding that you might be.
Okay. So that when I said that the guy who identified that 10 microsecond time for identifying voice and instrument differences is looking at how the auditory cortex feeds back to the auditory nerves in the cochlea, or the bundle that comes out of the cochlea, and telling it it's the same as the cocktail party effect. It's saying, I want to listen to Brett, but the noise level is higher than his voice level, but I can cut everything out because I have enough information about what his voice sounds like. Often people think you need a third stream of information that's visual, but you don't. You can do this kind of training where very quickly you know what Brett's voice sounds like, and that's the feedback between the auditory cortex and so that's like a kind of, I don't know, there's probably a neural network that has that kind of architecture to it. And that might be a way to, I'd be happy to look into that more. Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, so I think now we should stop here, and Ben will stay here to finish his pizza from 1 p.m. to 1:30. So if you have more questions, feel free to stay on here, and we can just chat like informally.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Sorry.